This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid-state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many, many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid state turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Milan Kordestani on the show. He is the author of a book called I'm Just Saying, a guide to maintaining civil discourse. So we're going to talk a lot about that and why that's important today and why us tech leaders need to know more about how we can maintain this civil discourse in our growing divided world. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Milan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, John. Good to be here.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little about your background, how you got to where you are today in your career, and why is it that you decided to write this?
Sure. So I grew up in Silicon Valley. I have two Iranian immigrant parents, and a lot of my early childhood was struggling with my communication. So I grew up with that background. I went to Catholic school despite, I grew up fairly non-religiously, but my parents sent me to Catholic school with this general belief that most religions have underlying common values, and they wanted to get those common values. And English was my third language after Farsi and Spanish. And there was this underlying trend in my life of struggling to communicate what I wanted, but believing in myself and believing in having my great intentions and an ability to create common ground with people. And so that's how I eventually got to writing this book. Along the way, I founded 3 different companies. Each of them is in one industry, respectively. So I have a company in the music industry. I have a publishing company that's called The Doe, and we publish everything anonymously, but verify our authors and vet the stories from them. And I have an education company called Audo, where we use artificial intelligence to basically create the curriculum adapted to the students' most ideal job outcomes. And so along the way of building these companies, going through COVID and learning how to move to become remote, and and then of course my own personal life and communication, I found that there was lots of lessons I wanted to share on how to become a better communicator, and how communication has really been so pivotal in allowing me to become successful in what I do, and be able to be successful in my working with other people to build companies. So yeah, that's what I do. Right now I incubate a few different companies, like the ones I just mentioned. And that's what I spend most of my time doing, is incubating technology startups.
Nice. And communication is one of those topics that we've had, I probably had 20 or 30 guests on to talk about communication in different forms or fashion. And it's always something that I get a lot of value from, because as a tech leader, I struggle sometimes in my introverted self being a good communicator. I struggle sometimes being able to get my point across. And even I see it at home when I'll be talking to my wife and I'll say something, and she hears it completely different than I said it. At least that's the way I hear it. But she says that I said it differently than what I thought I said it. And there's all this confusion that goes on with communication. How is it that you've seen kind of people get miscommunication happen across different spectrums and different areas, where it's led to either good things or bad things in your career?
It's a great question. And I think that the majority of the time people get bogged down on one of 2 points. One is either trying to make a point and worrying so much about what they are going to say to be correct or be perceived correctly, that they don't actually listen to what the other person is saying. And it actually is a very, it's not like a conversation. It's like 2 people talking at each other. And, the second really is not having intention in what the conversation is about. And for me, and what civil discourse advocates for, is that the intention of every conversation should be common ground. This idea that if we're conversing with someone, we're talking with them because we want to create connection. And inherently, we believe there's value in humans connecting with one another. That's what makes us super unique as a species. We build these societies and cultures, and we're more powerful together when we all can agree and get behind things. And so really, this idea that whether it's a conversation with your spouse, your family members, and so on, the intention should always be seeking some basic level of common ground and then building up from there. So yeah.
Yeah, so I love that, because that's one of the things that when I look at our society today in general, we have people from different sides and different factions that agree on like 90% of everything, and there's this 10% that's different, but all they focus on is that 10% of things that are different. Like I'll take me and my brother-in-law for example. He's a Washington Commanders football fan, right? And I'm a Philadelphia Eagles football fan. So we both love football. So we should be like right in the middle of that thing. But because he pulls for the wrong team, we're going to have a little bit of disagreements here and there. But, 90% of the same, we love the same things, but that 10% is off. So what do we talk about most of the time? That 10%.
Of course. And I mean, that's reflective of everything in society. Like the media industry does that same thing too, right? It's like there's a lot of values most Americans have in common with one another. That's why we usually choose to stay in countries that we are in, or especially if you have the choice to. And it's because there's common values here. But the media doesn't do that, right? It tends to divide us. And like you just alluded to, it exists in every level, right? Like, we can talk about gun control, for example, and the conversation is, well, people want, their kids to feel safe, and they want their kids to be safe. Underlying, we all agree and value that as a society. Now, where do we go from there? And like, that's the type of conversation we should be having. And it goes all the way down to like, in the tech world. All right, well, we're all technologists here, and we're all trying to build companies that are solving some sort of problem. But there's probably not going to be one technology stack that we all agree is going to be the technology stack forever, and that we all have to use it. And, that's the most optimized way to build, and so on, right? Like there's always going to be different solutions for different problems. And, that's kind of the mentality, I think, that we have to start to adapt to understand.
So how do we frame that? Like, let's say we're in a meeting at work. We want to frame that, we all have the same common goal. When you see this discourse, maybe you have one group over there, they're the AWS side. They want everything to be hosted in AWS, and the other side is the Azure side. They want everything in Azure. And there's this one lone wolf out there that says, well, it needs to be in Google Cloud. How do we bring us all together and start us all so we're not arguing right off the bat, but we're having a productive conversation with the correct goals in mind?
Great question. So I think it always starts with this one question of why. And that is what we have to ask people when they have an opinion or a perspective that we disagree with, or, like if someone comes in and immediately says, well, I want to use, I don't know, IBM, and I want to go with them, and I've worked with them in the past, and so on. We have to ask, well, why do we want to use IBM instead of using AWS, and so on? And that conversation then allows us to understand, well, okay, well, maybe this individual wants to use IBM because they've used it in their past, and they're actually kind of interested in, like, it's what's more comfortable for them. But maybe the majority of the team likes to use AWS, and it's actually more cost effective to the business, and so on. And when you start getting into those conversations, then you start to realize, like, okay, well, is this one person who is on our team willing to learn and willing to grow? And that mindset, right, is kind of what we want to start to cultivate. This idea that we have to all be willing and open to changing our opinions and perspectives when presented with new information. And to get to that point where we can do that, we have to be able to understand, like, and question, why are we being defensive? Why are we, advocating for something or trying to make a point when maybe we don't even need to be doing so, And that question of why constantly allows us to get there. It's like that little kid who's like, second grade kid who's just like, why is the sky blue? Well, why is this like this? That mentality allows you to understand people better and show them that you care to understand them. And hopefully that allows you to find some common ground.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And, it reminds me of, I did a podcast many years ago. I called it the fifth why, about how to ask, all the way, keep asking until you get to that fifth why at least, so you can dig down into what the real reasons are, and to let people know that you're actually listening to them, because it's really hard just to keep saying why if you don't know what they said before. So you actually have to listen, which you talked about earlier. And that is one of the things that I struggle with sometimes is listening, especially when I have this idea in my head, because I have this fear that I'm going to lose this idea if I don't spit it out there really quickly. So I shut down sometimes on listening. What are some tips that you have for people to be better listeners, especially leaders, like when they're in those one-on-one situations?
Yeah. So I have this whole chapter in this book about ego and
Mm,
how critical it is to recognize our own ego in conversation. And it's not to say that ego is all bad, but it's to say that we need to be able to reflect and recognize it, because a lot of that ego is what detracts us from having really productive conversations in civil discourse. This idea that when we're talking and I come up with an idea halfway through the conversation and I hold on to that, and now I don't listen to the second half of anything that the person was going to say, can be detracting actually from actually having productive conversation. Because if I'm responding to, what they said in the first half of their statement, and by the time they get to the question that they're asking, I'm answering a totally different thing, then we're just talking at each other, And so the point I make on ego is it's a little bit of a recognition of like, if I need to put my opinions and my stance kind of aside for the sake of finding common ground solutions, right? Like when I am here talking to someone, I have all of my values, of course, and that's at the end of the day, my values matter in the conversation too. However, making a specific point is not the objective of the conversation. The point and the objective of the conversation is the common ground. And we talk about that in relationships a lot, right? Like if you are right and your wife is wrong, then your wife is unhappy. And it goes vice versa, right? And most relationships, right, you want to have a sense that both people are mutually happy and taking care of each other and working together to, I don't want to say compromise, but meet each other halfway, perhaps. And that is the crux of civil discourse, and a value that I believe we want to really prioritize in culture and society.
So since you brought up ego, let's dig in a little bit deeper on that one, because that's that's one of those topics that comes up quite a bit, especially in the tech community. Because I know when I look at myself included, I feel like my answers are always right. I feel like my way of doing things is always right, even though a lot of times it's not. And I have to always try to check my ego at the door, and it's a challenging thing. And one of the books that's helped me a lot with that is Ryan Holiday's book, "Ego is the Enemy." What is your take? Yeah. What is your take on tips for people that struggle with this ego thing and it looming over them, especially because if you look at leaders in tech, they're people that were obviously good at something. They were good at coding. They were good at software engineering. They were good at designing or something like that. And they got promoted up in their career to become a leader, a manager, a team.
Right.
And their ego is, kind of baked into there because they've heard so many compliments, so many good performance reviews. How do we get past that and realize that, God, the only way we're really going to grow is to have some humility and realize the fact that, we're not, everything to technology.
I think it's that exact point you just made. It's that realization of ego being a detractor from our ability to grow. That when we hold on to ego and think that we are so justified and so righteous in our own opinion or our stance or experience, it actually inhibits us from then being able to grow and be this like lifelong learner who constantly is taking in information and adapting. It's no different from saying like, okay, I started using Windows and I was a Microsoft user in 2002, and because of that I reject all of Apple and I don't want to use an Apple MacBook, even if it might be better for my purposes today, right? Like that is ego holding you back from potentially getting a solution that is more helpful for you. And that's like a very specific example, right? But yeah, I think there's, my hope is books like this help people realize that. And of course, with books and such, we put content out in the world. And I know Ryan Holiday does a great job putting out content in the world in bite-sized pieces as well, on like stoicism, especially. And I think that in a modern world where people are a little bit less religious as they once were, these philosophies become really applicable actually to modern day and digital communication. They're kind of timeless, which is quite amazing to see. So yeah, I think that those are ways we can kind of break through to people and help them understand how ego is usually in the way of your growth.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I've started reading the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday right now. I'm kind of going through that to try to keep myself grounded with some of these, traditional ideas. Going back to one of the things that I think we've kind of hit on a little bit, but I don't know if it's ego that is the cause or relationship to this or not. But one of the problems that I see when people are having discussions, and we hit on it before, that they're not listening, they want to make their point, is that sometimes you become, your identity becomes tied to the point you're arguing, or the belief that you have, and it's strange to me to realize that sometimes my identity is what is the argument that I'm making, versus realizing that I am separate from that idea, and I can get rid of that idea. Going back to the PC and Mac, I was a PC guy for many years, from like Windows 3.1 all the way up to NT and all this good stuff. And then I got a job being a manager of a web and mobile development team, and we had to build iOS apps. So I needed a Mac in order to compile and build iOS apps. So I started using a Mac, and I fell in love with it. And it's one of those things where if I let PC become, my identity, then I wouldn't have been able to make that switch and advance my career. Did you see people making their own ideas their identity?
I do. I see that a lot. And I think it's to the detriment almost every time to make an idea your identity, because it again goes to that notion of being static, right? Like the second you take on an idea as an identity, you're basically closing the door to being able to change your opinion on some sort of idea when presented with new information. And all we do in a modern day society is get bombarded with new information. And so it's so important to basically, be able to take that in and change your opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you think back about like science in general. Science is all about coming up with a hypothesis and running experiments to disprove that hypothesis, right? And I feel like we've lost that way, and we realize that once we come up with an idea, we want that idea to be right. So much or so badly we want that to be right that we're gonna almost ignore the truth whenever we hear it, because we don't want to be wrong.
Yes, this is one of the big points I also talk about in the book, is how important reflection is to be able to be wrong, or to be okay being wrong, because it's human to be wrong. And it's interesting, like in a tech capacity, when we talk about AI, and for everyone who's working on AI now, like at least in some form to understand it, it's really amazing how far it's come and how far generative AI has come. But it's also really interesting to see how flawed it still is, because it's trained from humans and information that we've been creating, and humans are imperfect. And so it's kind of this like understanding that I think is super important, that we are flawed beings inherently, and that we are going to need to be able to admit when we're wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's a value that we should prioritize as a society, because if we don't do that, the alternative is cancel culture. It's that anytime you are wrong, and in a modern world where everything is, dictated onto the internet, it's permanent. If we can't acknowledge that people can be wrong and just, push them to want to change, if that's not a value that we support, then we're basically going to see a lot of people hold back sharing their opinions, hold back sharing their thoughts, and hold back, trying to conduct civil discourse, which I think ultimately is a detriment to the progress of society.
Yeah, no, I think we've seen a lot of that now, especially in tech. And I also teach part-time at Winthrop University, so I see that a lot in the education world. There's a lot of professors that would like to have conversations about certain areas, but they're afraid to, because they're afraid of what the pushback may be.
Right. It's definitely, it's a challenge.
So you mentioned cancel culture, and I feel like we hit the peak of that a while back, and I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but I feel like we're kind of backing away from that. We're not canceling as quickly as we were, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Where do you see that going, and where do you think that we are on that scale?
I think that we're understanding that social media is really powerful when we all come together, and just like anything else, right? When humans come together, we're innately more powerful. But on social, it's so easy to congregate against or for certain things, and the speed with which we can cancel someone is often detrimental, because again, it doesn't consider the fact that we're human, we're going to make mistakes, and that we almost want to be able to expect people to change and to grow, and that's a value we want to support. So, I think that Gen Z especially is going to be more tolerant, especially when we see this like a lot with the way that content goes out too. So on TikTok, for example, a lot of content that performs really well is quite raw. It's quite unedited and authentic. And a lot of the content that previously used to perform really well, the high quality, perfectionist type content, doesn't do as well. And what I believe that is it almost reflects a sentiment of this upcoming generation that is, we want authenticity and we want to believe it. And that is going to translate into what we see in our communication online as well. This need for an ability to be human, to say, okay, you can be wrong, or you can put a statement out into the world, and 5 years from now, you're allowed to have a different opinion. And, I hope that's where we're moving towards.
No, I hope so too. I know it's one of the values that, with my team, we really focus on, is trying to be transparent and authentic wherever we can be. And, if you are putting off something that's not really what you believe, then it's going to fail. I go back to it. Simon Sinek talks a lot about, starting with why, and, showing what you believe, and being, it's not about like what I think or what I feel or what I want you to think that I think, or what I want you to think that I believe. It's what I really believe. And that's what's the most important part.
Right. I fully agree.
So getting back into how to have these conversations and how to be authentic, because that's one thing that, over the past several years, we may have been afraid to put ourselves out there. We may have been afraid to, truly express our own opinions. And, how can we change that? Once we've gotten into a rut of not being able to do that, how can we change that as an individual?
I think that it's really important to become confident in our skills and ability to keep a conversation civil, and to recognize when it's almost past that point, or we're speaking with someone that's incapable of it. And that is part of what I think is important, as I've mentioned several times here, is the values we're creating in culture, and how, as a culture, we want to create, a society that values civil discourse. I think it goes to that, because a lot of times, as like a young technologist and, someone that grows up, like even myself, spending lots of time behind a screen and less interaction with humans face to face, we're starting to move to a culture that then doesn't have the actual skills to be able to communicate as effectively with one another. And like even wearing headphones in an airport, walking through life, and not interacting with certain people who are kind of whispering because you can't really hear them properly. Like all of that is almost, it allows you to miss the micro conversations and the micro interactions that give you the hope and the courage and the confidence to then be able to have the really difficult conversations in life. And so, I think that it starts with becoming confident in your own ability. And that starts with learning how to do that, reading like a book like mine and seeing how important it is to minimize your ego, how to be intentional in conversation, what tools can help you practice active listening better, so that you're not just talking at someone, but you're listening and responding to them, confidently and clearly. All of that is, is how I believe that we get to that point in time.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any advice for, let's say I'm a parent of 3 kids, and, one of the things that I've seen challenging with my children, you talked about screen time, it's just the general things that I consider polite conversations that sometimes they don't have. Like I'll call my daughter, I'm driving home, and I'll call her, and she'll say, yeah. And that's how she answers the phone. Like, no, that's not how you answer a phone. And then at the end of the phone, she doesn't say bye. When she's done talking, she just hangs up, like, what are you doing? How do you help instill that proper way of communicating when you're raising children?
That's a great question, and I'll answer that by saying I haven't yet raised children, but I do have a few younger siblings that range from four. Let's see, I have a 4-year-old, 8, 9, and 14, and among each of them, there is it's interesting, right? There's a lot of shyness, there's awkwardness at different ages, and then as it gets to the teenage years, it's more like rebellion. And the way that I really believe that people are going to be able to communicate better at a young age is by getting them to care and to see how powerful great communication can be for them. And the only way to get past that is to take that first initial step out of the awkwardness. And I don't know if it's a parent that needs to really just push on it, or if it's seeing it role modeled by someone else that's actually not a parent, because I know how hard it is to get, like as a kid, your parents are telling you all of this information all the time, and you're kind of start to start to tune it out and be like, okay, yeah, like I've heard it 1,000 times, but sometimes hearing it from someone else and get role models can be really inspiring. And so even within my book, I talk about some of the people in my life, whether they were on TV and the news or so on, that it inspired me to have great conversations. A couple of those were like Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers on television, and Tone. Another is Oprah Winfrey, and she was one of the first Black TV hosts to host a conversation with skinheads on TV and try to find some sort of civil discourse and create common ground, which was wild. And eventually they come back on TV like 10 years later and say, yeah, we actually changed because of that conversation, and we spent the rest of our lives trying to help people who are skinheads or in the KKK come out of it and understand that this isn't like the way we build a country that we love. And so it's pretty incredible, right? Like you have to get inspired and you have to see it role modeled, I think, to truly be able to understand the value of it in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to a work perspective, one of the ways that I've seen that valued was, I go back to Simon Sinek. He had a book where he talked about, you can send out a survey and ask people how they, feel about a certain thing at your office, or how they feel about your leadership skills or something like that. But how much more does it mean to ask those exact same questions in a one-on-one conversation?
Right.
It's just this commitment of time and effort that goes into that one-on-one conversation that means so much more than any survey ever could.
Right. And I think there's a lot of fear, right? Like we mentioned this at a macro level with cancel culture, but even at a micro level, there's a fear that even if we show up our best to a conversation, that other people might not do that, right? That they were going to get angry, or they'll yell, or they'll get emotional, and that can be scary, right? So in truth, I think that especially in the workplace, when it's difficult conversations, it requires a lot of courage to go and say, I'm going to have this as a one-on-one conversation face to face. And that's usually the best way to do these things versus any other form, which tends to be kind of passive. It can be passive aggressive or seem like you don't really care. And at the end of the day, it's so important to make sure that other people understand your intention and your perspective so that they can respond accordingly.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think it does require a lot of courage. How can we, reach down inside of us and have that bravery to start those conversations when we know they need to be made?
Honestly, I think it's a lot of philosophy has helped me. There was a great book I read recently about, I believe it was Adlerian psychology, and it was super interesting. This idea that so much of like our perspective on how to be happy actually comes down to how we perceive the world and how we show up for conversations and so on. And that is the crux of courage, is every time we make a courageous action, it actually becomes easier and we become happier. And that being courageous builds a happy life, because anytime that we decide to be courageous, we're usually making a move in favor of ourselves or in favor of our people or whatever it is. And so when you make those decisions, you're choosing not to be complacent, and you're choosing to be really proactive in the decisions for your life. And so it really is about defending kind of your sanity. That's what courage, in my opinion, is about. And so I hope that, people can discover the right information, whether it's through shows like this or, books, social media posts, to get that courage, because it is hard, but the first time you do it, you start to kind of get this momentum to then be able to make a lot more courageous decisions and start conversations in your life that are difficult.
Yeah, I think one of the things that sounds like you're kind of hitting around the corner of is that, you need to be, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll be doing it, right? So maybe you need to be, practice being uncomfortable.
Yes. And, like Gary Vee talks about this a lot, like this idea that if you want to grow on social media, you have to post tons and tons of content. Like he's like 4 pieces of content on every channel, and starting that out, making content, you see how scary that is. Like, wow, I have to put that much of myself out there. And, the second you start to do it, then you can start to critique yourself better and become more open to feedback. And, it's repetition that, like anything else, allows you to become successful. And so the same is true for being courageous and in having difficult conversations. The more you do it, the easier it gets.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And, I love Gary Vee's content. I think it's great. He used to do that Daily V show, which was pretty awesome. And I actually teach, one of the classes I teach at Winthrop is digital information design. It's more like the business of the web. And one of the books that we used was Crushing It.
Oh, nice. I honestly, I wish I had teachers or professors that were giving me those types of content.
Well, I feel like it's important, because we were teaching about digital media and lots of different areas in that. So one of the books I had was Todd Henry's book, Accidental Creative, and because I think that's another really foundational book for people getting out of college to think about like what careers they're going to do, especially if you're in tech or in a creative field. And then Gary Vee's book, which I thought was really important.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe your book will be added to the list.
I hope so. I mean, we'll see. This is definitely my first book, which was required a lot of courage for me as well. And I recorded the whole thing in audio form as well. So it exists anywhere that you consume audiobooks. And, anytime you do that and you have to speak a lot of the stories that you wrote down out loud, you start to kind of question, like, oh, wow, I'm really putting myself out there. Like, what is my mother going to think? But it's also an exercise in growth. So I'm glad to have it out there. And I hope at least, one young entrepreneur finds this and maybe finds the courage to start a difficult conversation they've been, scared to have.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what made you want to put this out there. What was the number one reason for putting this out there? And what was your biggest challenge in doing so?
Yeah. So I think the main reason I wanted to put this out into the world was because I felt like everything I had been doing up until that point, or like 2 years ago, when I had about 3 companies I had started, I was starting to understand that I wanted to incubate various startups so that I could have impact at scale. But I was also writing a lot, and I had been writing for, since I was 16 years old. I started writing for the Huffington Post, and when I was 18, I started writing for Entrepreneur, and I've always loved the ability to connect with people through my writing. And so there was this moment of feeling like, if I build companies to scale my solutions, then the way to reach people on a micro level, in case those don't work, right? Like you build these big dreams of what you can do at scale, but if that doesn't work, if I can write something that impacts just one life and they continue on that legacy or continue on that mission that I was trying to build a scalable solution for, then, I've made an impact, and that's some sort of lasting impact in pursuit of my dream or my mission. And so that was the dream behind writing a book, and I hope I get the opportunity to write many more, because, there's lots of missions and pursuits that I'm trying to, work on by building companies that solve those problems at scale. But it takes a village to solve any problem. And, I hope to inspire people to work on solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can people connect with you online and get a copy of your book and learn more about your companies and the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm at Milan Kordestani on all socials. And you can go to milankordestani.com. You can also find the book at civildiscoursebook.com, or just search I'm Just Saying on Amazon or anywhere you buy books, and it should be there.
Oh, one last question. Where'd you get that title?
I'm Just Saying. So yeah, I'm Just Saying was this moment of, we had a different title for the book that was kind of placeholder, until one day I was sitting there and, I was kind of talking to my phone on voice notes, one of the stories I wanted to include in the book. And I was kind of frustrated telling the story. And I was like, gosh, like, how am I going to say this in a way that people get it? Like, I'm just saying this so that people get it. And there was kind of like a light bulb moment of, whoa, the whole thing is kind of like I'm just saying. And it was this realization that people say that out of frustration most of the time. Like, you'll say at the end of making a point that the other person hasn't gotten, hasn't understood or taken in, and you're just like, I'm just saying, like, So that's how we got it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's I hear so many arguments or discussions where I'm having someone, they say, well, I'm just saying,
Right. Exactly.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I'll link all that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com. Milan, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, John. This was great.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some t-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.